Hi, I'm Professor Hopkins, and I will be acting as moderator today for our conversation with Professor Derrick Bell. I take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the format for today's program. First, we will start off by allowing Professor Bell to open up the dialogue by talking a little bit about his new book, Gospel Choirs, Psalms of Survival in an Alien Land. And then we will open the floor for comments and questions to the audience. We have several microphones stationed at strategic spots in the audience, and we ask that you attempt to use a microphone that's near you so that your questions will be heard. We are currently videotaping this, and we want all questions and comments to be heard. At this time, I introduce to you our Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Dean Susan Brody, who will then in turn introduce to you Professor Derrick Bell.
Thank you. I guess I'll be the first one to test out these microphones. It is, excuse my back here, I'm not quite sure how to do this. It is a real honor for me to welcome all of you here and to introduce Professor Bell to you. As we all know, Professor Bell is a preeminent civil rights and constitutional law scholar. We honor him specifically today for his new book, Gospel Choirs, which, as Professor Barksdale told you, will be available downstairs later. Professor Bell is the former Weld Professor of Law at Harvard University, where he chose dismissal from his tenured position rather than end his protest about the law school's continuing failure to appoint a woman law professor of color. Indeed, one of Professor Bell's other books, Confronting Authority, addresses the events that surrounded that matter at Harvard. In addition to Confronting Authority and Gospel Choirs, Professor Bell has written two other books, And We Are Not Saved and Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Professor Bell, however, is not just a preeminent scholar. He is an invaluable mentor. He has given his wisdom and his counsel to many law professors throughout the country, and indeed to many students throughout the country as well. Professor Bell is not only a scholar and a mentor, but we know him, especially here at John Marshall, as an enlightened and an insightful speaker. Indeed, this is Professor Bell's second visit to John Marshall. In 1993, we had the honor of having Professor Bell here for our Braun Memorial Distinguished Lecture Symposium. The symposium was entitled Toward Achieving Racial Diversity. Professor Bell spoke on the politics of race in legal education. His speech was memorable, and it contributed significantly to the scholarly exchange and intellectual life at the John Marshall Law School. Professor Bell's principles and his battles, so to speak, are not limited to the issues of race. Indeed, I'm told when he was dean at the University of Oregon, he faced a different kind of battle. The school had an environmental law clinic, which was involved in litigation concerning saving trees. At the time, and as still is the case today, the state of Oregon thrives heavily on the forest industry. And indeed, Professor Bell found himself in an unusual situation. On the one hand, the students at the clinic who wanted to litigate the Save the Forests cases, and the state legislature, which supported not only the forest industry, but also the law school as well. Indeed, as Professor Bell has done in many other instances, he was able to satisfy everyone, the students, the clinic, and indeed, the Oregon legislature. You might ask yourself, how does a person become able to be that way, to satisfy everyone, to stick to his principles? I'm told by Professor Michael Sang, who attended a workshop with Professor Bell in the summer of 1980, that Professor Bell has a unique combination of qualities. Though his ideas are forceful, he is a gentle person. And I want to digress for a minute to tell you exactly how Professor Sang knows Professor Bell. In the summer of 1980, Professor Sang had the honor of attending a workshop on race relations at Harvard taught by Professor Bell. Professor Sang speaks of that experience, which he had with just 11 other students, as one that was extremely influential on his career. And indeed, what Professor Sang learned about Professor Bell during that time was this incredible combination of the force and passion of ideas. together with a gentle demeanor. One might expect fiery rhetoric from a man who has been involved in civil rights matters, but one doesn't get that. And indeed, it is the overwhelming combination of passion and intensity of his ideas and the force of his ideas about civil rights, but together with a gentle demeanor, that make Professor Bell an unmatched scholar and an unmatched mentor for us all. With that in mind, it is my honor to introduce Professor Bell to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Brody and Kevin and Yvette, for all of the work you're getting, and all of you who've come this afternoon. It's a wonderful introduction. I don't know about the part about satisfying everyone. I've never been very good at that. But you left out some things there. One is that I've become a producer. Gospel choir seems a very strange title for a person with a background like the one you just heard. But I've decided, I guess it may be heresy to say it here, that the problems that we face in this society are not likely to be solved by law, test case, litigation, and so on. Those who have read the Supreme Court's decisions in the last few years in any of the major areas of domestic concern can vouch for that. Similarly, I doubt if our political process is going to be up to the task, given the way those who are our elected representatives represent those who put up the big bucks to enable them to run successfully for office. Sure, we got to keep trying with both of them, but to rely entirely on them, I think, is foolhardy. So that in this book, Gospel Choirs is not about gospel music, but is rather inspired by gospel music. Because I think that there has to be a great deal, much more self-reliance by little people. And this is not, it sounds like a conservative theme, but as I hope you'll see, it really isn't. That we really have to look back to in the culture to those things. And for Black people, it is religion. It is the music of the religion, which is in effect not only a legacy coming down from our forebears, but also really a theology in musical terms. So that generally, with my readings from the book, I have been working with gospel music, either a huge choir like the one I had at the Trinity United Church of Christ yesterday afternoon, which was just a fantastic experience, about 180 voices, if you can believe it, or sometimes just a single soloist. I didn't bring either of them here, but that enables me to provide another precedent. For example, how many of you have ever had any of your law teachers begin a class with music? You see my point. I mean, that we have lacked a kind of humanity that we really need in order to deal. You know, when I went to law school, the idea was if you learn how to analyze cases and dig into the doctrine in objective, neutral fashion, the courts would just fall out in reverie and what have you. The decisions would come your way. And, well, of course, it's far from like that. That we really have to reach down beyond the cases and deal with people. And one way you deal with people is the unifying force of song. Now, I have one problem since I didn't bring any of either the choirs or the individuals. What do I know that you know? It seems to me that there's only one appropriate song or hymn that kind of cuts across all ideological religious lines, and that is Amazing Grace. Because everybody knows that. Hands, please, hands, Amazing Grace. Oh, let's see that. I knew it. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. And there's only one other little problem. I'm not a great singer. But I know how to start, and if you kind of come in not too loud, listening to one another, adding a little harmony, whatever, we'll be able to get my portion of this program off to a good start. Are we ready? Amazing grace, How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Pretty good. Pretty good. I thought I'd read just a section from the book as a prelude to the questions that can roam almost any place you want them to go. We all know the history. Long ago, the slave singers, by interweaving melody and lyric in songs of faith, can you still hear me? The spirituals. They were able to transcend the awful oppression that defined their lives. Embracing religion that was undergirded by this music helped slaves to be free in their own minds. It gave their imaginations nourishment for creating a world of freedom where they could be whoever they felt they truly were. Not just someone's chattel who was worked, beaten, raped, maimed, sold, killed for profit or sport. The music encompasses all of their despair and empowers the singers with faith and determination that even today we recognize and respect. Of course, black music communicates a political as well as a religious dimension. During the slave era, it helped bind the disparate peoples of Africa into a single community. While praising Jesus, the words of those songs also contain directions from those planning to escape slavery and seek freedom in the North. A full century or more later, the civil rights movement, those black and white protesters who risked well-being, even their lives, to break down Jim Crow laws, they found strength in songs written by slaves, and they transformed them into what they called freedom songs. Even today, it is no accident that black students and white enrolled in some of our even most prestigious colleges find that to deal with the current pressures in education, they get release and relief by forming and singing in gospel choirs. Well, in this book, I try to build on this history, and I try to address the issues that today trouble our minds and weary our souls. Each of these stories is intended as a psalm of survival in this alien land we call home. The racial libel of the media, the hostility of current court decisions, the exploiting of our culture, the haunting fear that civil rights efforts benefit we professionals far more than the rank and file folk we claim we want to help. In one story, at least three of the stories are devoted to the necessity, in my view, to recognize the resources in the black community, one of which is black women. And are aiming at one of my heroines, Geneva Crenshaw, organizes millions of women to suddenly appear at major intersections across the country. And on the day when a very serious piece of anti-black legislation is up for final vote in the Congress, final discussion, final vote, they suddenly began hearing in their heads music that they all know and love, the electric slide. And they go out into the streets, the viaducts, all the rest, and all day long they do the electric slide, do it as only black women can. Of course, the police come in and order them away. They get ignored. Police do not like getting ignored, particularly by blacks, particularly by black women. And they go in and start whipping and what have you, but nothing will deter them. So by the end of the day, when Congress looks out and sees all across the mall, across the Capitol grounds, all these women doing the electric slide as never before, they decided they should put off the legislation. Well, one of my points was that protests are necessary because today, as in earlier times, the rights, even the lives of blacks, are subject to becoming a commodity that can be sacrificed by whites for their own needs and self-interest. The basic story, like many of my stories, written for my students to convince them when they're a little kind of hesitant to move to the next step. The space traders, this conviction about our vulnerability to being sacrificed to serve the interests of the majority. In the story, as many of you know, this conviction becomes awful truth. When aliens from some alien distant world swoop down on the United States, they land near gigantic ships all along the Atlantic coast, and they make the nation an extraordinary offer. They have brought in these ships, they tell us, sufficient gold, stores of gold to pay off all of our debts, national, state, and local. They brought as well chemicals to clean up our environment that is in bad shape, and a safe nuclear engine and fuel to replace the fast disappearing fossil fuel sources. In return, the space traders want only one thing. They want to take back to their home star all African Americans, all those who on official birth certificates, passports, what have you, are listed as black. Well, most blacks are horrified by this proposal, as are some whites. There's barely restrained glee from other whites and a great deal of ambivalence from the rest. In the story, there's 2 weeks of furious debate following with a national referendum on the issue. The result, 70% of the citizenry vote yes for the trade, and the trade goes forward. Well, as I end the book in which this story appeared, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, the final paragraph is that dawn on the day of the trade presented an extraordinary sight. In the night, the space traders had drawn their strange ships right up to the beaches and discharged their cargoes of gold and minerals and machinery, leaving vast empty holds. Crowded on the beaches are the black people, some 20 million silent men, women, children, including babes in arms. As the sun rose, the space traders directed them first to strip off all but a single undergarment, then to line up, and finally to enter those holds which yawned in the morning light like Milton's darkness visible. The black people looked fearfully behind them, but on the dunes above the beaches, guns at the ready, stood U.S. guards. There was no escape, no alternative. Heads bowed, arms now linked by slender chains, black people left the New World as their forebears had arrived. Well, the new book contains as the first story a response to the many people who wanted to know, Bell, what happened? What happened after the ships took off? And this is a part of that story. We passed through that curtain of darkness into a vast enclosure, a realm of light. Above us, around us, glowed and pulsated all the colors of the rainbow, dazzling my eyes, softening my grim expectations. From somewhere over our heads, a hidden voice spoke. Raise your arms and clap your hands. This was no longer the clone of Ronald Reagan's voice with which the space traders had used to conduct their negotiations with the United States. This was definitely a black voice, warm and resonant, but I couldn't tell whether a man's or a woman's. As we raised our arms in response to the command, the manacles and chains that bound our hands together and us to one another fell off with a fearsome clattering. Look down. Again the voice, sounding now more familiar, a harmonious blending of perhaps Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee. Obeying again, we found at our feet not those emblems and instruments of our servitude, but a folded piece of beautifully woven cloth. We understood that we were to pick it up, and as we did, each unfurled into a soft robe which we put on to wrap around our near nakedness. Take a deep breath and stand perfectly still. The soft colors surrounding us coalesced into a brilliant flash of light. Behind me, I heard my friend Geneva's soft voice, "Keep the faith, friend." Then there was darkness. I stood in place with everyone else, neither awake nor asleep, relaxed yet not lethargic, unable to act yet clear of mind. I knew that time was passing, but I had no idea how much. Well, after unimaginable, immeasurable time, the light flashed again, and again the hidden voice spoke. Attention, African Americans. It is now 2 months, as you reckon time, since we took off from your United States of America. Ahead of us lies still a long journey, but circumstances have made it necessary for us to share with you immediately our motivations and our plans. You see, we have been studying Earth and its people for a long time, particularly the experiment with democracy in your United States, and even more particularly, the blot on that experiment, the refusal to grant you full human rights along with its white citizens. We've watched your long travail, from the first slaves kidnapped into the country in 1619 to the crass and despicable acceptance of our offer to trade you for gold and other resources. Ours is, as you have doubtless guessed, a society technologically advanced beyond anything you know on Earth. And yet, astute as we have been, we have somehow lacked an element that you might call human. We have not been able to recreate the emotional and spiritual strength whereby you have sustained that humanity through all your travails. We cannot, that is, recreate your ability to transcend your suffering, to sing through it, as you yourselves might say. Well, after observing America, we thought that perhaps if we offered it enough of the wealth it seems to treasure beyond all else, it might be persuaded to part with the human treasure you and your people constitute. We want to bring you back to our home star, to be settlers there, to mingle with our citizens as equals and full partners in our development and growth. And so we devised ships to carry us through space to your country. And so we made our offer. And when it was accepted, we were, even from our long acquaintance with your history, we were amazed. We now have another reason for amazement. We have been in these 2 months monitoring the thoughts of each and every one of you for any sign of illness or serious distress. And we find that many of you are inexplicably, at least to us, longing to return to the land that you call home. That you long for this, even though it is also a land that practices the most pernicious racism anywhere in the universe. And even though it easily banished you against your will, sent you off to an unknown fate. It's perhaps indicative of our emotional ignorance that we assume that you would be glad of an opportunity to leave America, to make a new start in our world. But since it is imperative to our plan that you enter our society voluntarily, we are going to ask you to vote on whether you wish to do so, or whether you wish to return to the land that has sheltered you so ambiguously these hundreds of years. If you decide on the latter, we will try to negotiate for your return. Before you vote, we must tell you something of what has been going on in these 2 months. America traded you for resources that should, with prudent management, have solved its problems for the moment and ensured its prosperity for at least a century to come. Even in this brief time, however, these resources have been almost completely dissipated in a series of fraudulent corporate and government transactions. The economy is now in shambles, the stock market is all but collapsed, more than half the population is unemployed, and your politicians, grown accustomed to using you to divert attention from their incompetence and corruption, are hard-pressed to create a scapegoat people to replace you. America, we have received the reports, America has had a change of heart, and they want you back. Should you return and hope that this time America's promises of equality will not prove false? Well, the space traders have been watching the electoral processes here, and they recognize that before any vote, there should be a debate. And they call on Gleason Golightly, a well-known black conservative, who urges that blacks return. He acknowledges past differences, but said now, literally, we are now in the same boat. Because we are black, our history has been one of suffering, sacrifice, persecution, exploitation. Yet is it not precisely that history that draws us back to our homes and the homes of our forebears? For to continue on with the space traders would be to abandon a civilization we helped create. And for what? For a strange world in which we can never be more than outsiders, inferior by any measure to beings who control technology beyond our wildest imagination. Yes, life in America is hard for African Americans. We all know that. But as we all also know, America, whether whites like it or not, is our land too. For better or worse, it is our home. Our roots are there. Our work is there. There we have lived our lives. There we have engaged in the struggle for our dignity, a struggle that, win or lose, is our true destiny. I dare say what you are thinking. Space traders, we appreciate everything you've tried to do for us, but we want to go home. In response, space traders asked my lawyer, prophet, heroine, Geneva Crenshaw, to speak. Mr. Golightly urges us to return home. But home, I ask you, to what? Given the turmoil there, the nation's leaders might well accept us back as a diversion from their current crisis. Oh, they might even promise racial justice that so long denied us and those who came before us. But whatever those promises, there will be no surprises. We will have heard them all before. Whatever the words, they will be as empty as all the other pledges of equality made to us since the Emancipation Proclamation. At each previous promise, at each new commitment to full equality, we believed them. And we hailed a new day, only to find that the change was cosmetic, not serious, more show than real reform. All of these pledges, don't you understand, have come to be one means or another to keep us enslaved without chains. For me, 400 years is enough. It's enough to convince me that America will never change, indeed is incapable of change. In war and in peace, we have been faithful patriots. But we have never understood that the essence of racism we contended against was not simply that we were exploited in slavery, degraded by segregation, frustrated by the unmet promises of equal opportunity. The essence of racism in America is the hope that we who are black would not exist. And now, thanks to the space traders, America has its wish. Mark my words. If we succumb to Mr. Golightly's entreaty to return, we will find, likely before the welcome parties are over, that the nation will heap on our shoulders the troubles it has created for itself during our absence. 400 years of subordinate status is enough. Let us continue with the space traders. Well, the space traders have been monitoring the minds of each of the individuals, as I said, and they are confused and perplexed. When Golightly speaks, overwhelming majority want to go back. When Geneva speaks, overwhelming majority want to go on. They each give a second speech, a rebuttal, a counter rebuttal. The same thing happens. Finally, disappointed, perplexed, the space traders order their ships to circle the galaxy until black people can make up their minds about what should happen next. Well, the theme of the story is that black rights can be enhanced or diluted depending less on the injustices they are suffering than on the needs and interests of whites in policy-making positions. And the danger of loss is particularly great during times of economic crisis. History not only teaches, it warns that in periods of severe economic distress, rights of blacks are eroded and the lives of blacks are endangered. A century ago, when the U.S. economy was disrupted by the change from an agricultural to an industrial base, American blacks were already hated by large segments of society, particularly hard-pressed farmers in the South, factory workers in the North, many of them recent immigrants. Black people became a target for the wrath and frustration of millions of whites as those whites were being squeezed by the change in job patterns. Now, as a result of a transformation from our industrial to a technological or computer economy, the patterns of job loss and racial antagonism they're worsening again at the same time that perhaps a majority of whites believe that racial discrimination is hardly more than a convenient excuse for blacks who crave preferences while disdaining performance. The fact is, blacks have been suffering the disappearance of work, particularly unskilled jobs, for more than 2 decades. And in the absence of work, there we've had the devastation of our inner cities, as William Julius Wilson has pointed out again so poignantly and effectively, hopefully, in his new book. It's destroyed families and precipitated many to turn to the underground and often unlawful activities for the livelihood the society has denied them. Meanwhile, practices of overt racism that we thought consigned to history are reappearing with all their old virulence. During this time, it seems only a special kind of faith, combined with fortitude, can enable us to survive the trials that we now face. And we must again call on that quiet courage in the face of official cowardice and patience in the face of perfidy. So that tempted and tried, we have to live during the week the message that we sing on Sunday with regard to I'm going to live the life I sing about in my song. It seems to me that once again, we're condemned to suffer because of economic conditions that we did not create. Blacks are bearing the brunt of unemployment, but we are also the focus of the rage of many whites who, fearful for their own jobs, and understandably so, are all too easily convinced by policymakers and politicians that the threat to their well-being is our black presence, rather than the real villain, corporate greed and public corruption. So that for all of these reasons, I believe that blacks as a people are in greater danger than we know, which seems to be ample cause for more concern than most of us are ready to acknowledge. I guess the hopeful sign is that the gospel music that inspired our forebears in crisis past is still there. As I indicated earlier, those from whom we came survived and managed to leave us a legacy of their music, which is in fact a theology in song. It's a music that can't be denied. So that with the courage of our forebears in our minds, their music in our hearts, we need to face individually and in unity our current status, determined to resist the temptations to denial, to co-optation, to hoping that a new and better day will dawn tomorrow without sacrificial action today. One last thing, that in our struggle against towering obstacles, we must not forget that those of us who want a better life do have resources. As Alice Walker observed, not in complaint, but in celebration. She said, we do not come from a people who have had nothing. We come rather from a people who have had everything, except money, except political power, except freedom. Our challenge then is to identify our everything, to define it, to refine it, to mold it, to include it in our hopes, in our prayers, in our work. And then, despite the dark clouds ahead, we need not be afraid. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bell. At this time, we are going to continue with our conversation with Derrick Bell, and we're going to open the dialogue up to the audience. We encourage questions, we encourage comments. I will tell you that I've read Professor Bell's Gospel Choirs. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was intellectually challenging, stimulating for me. I advocate it. If you've not read it, I advocate after this this lecture that you go out, that you buy the book. And we've got the double bonus today of having Professor Bell sign the book after today's discussion. But at this time, we open up this part of the lecture, or this part of the conversation, for comments by you out there in the audience. Any comments, any questions?
Rebuttal. Equal time.
Please use the microphones. I will start, I guess, the conversation off, Professor Bell. I was intrigued with the Space Trader sequel, and I guess my question to you would be, given the oppression of Black Americans in the United States, why would there be such a dilemma in deciding to come back? I'd like to get your comments, your feelings about that struggle, that internal struggle amongst Black Americans, at least on that ship.
Well, it's really like most allegories, intended to portray what is real with regard to direction. For example, there's probably as many directions that we should go in as there are individuals, and trying to gain a consensus is particularly hard when you're dealing with relatively powerless people. The scars of racism are real. They're not imaginary. And the contributions, the arguments that Golightly makes are real, that we have made contributions, that we haven't got credit. Why should we substitute one form of oppression, political, economic oppression, to what he feels would almost certainly be technological oppression of people who have evolved far beyond anything we have been able to do in the technical line? So that they're, well, if I ask for the blacks in the audience, you're up there on the ships, and this thing is posed to you. How many would agree with Gleason Golightly that you should go back? Well, what can you say? we got what? How many would prefer to go on? How many would need more time to make up their mind?
Once again, indicating the diversity amongst Black people. Yes. Would you please use the mic? Thank you.
Now, is this technological overkill or not? You see the size of the room. You see the number of. If I were to school, I would demand a reduction in tuition of next semester. It's obvious.
My name is Kimberly Seymour. I'm a graduate of John Marshall Law School. My question is a simple one. At Harvard University, did you have participation with Black students in the protest against there not being any female Black professors? Was there participation?
Well, I was really supporting their effort.
Okay. I'm sorry of my not knowing much about the protest.
Well, then there's a book called Confronting Authority on sale at your. Now, I hate to be very crass about this, but it just seems to me. Now, you tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me, but if Terry McMillan can sell 1 million books in the first month talking about sex, shouldn't I be able to sell 1/10 of that number talking about survival? Now, what's the difference, right? Isn't both of those equally important? No, I have never forgotten that I would not have been at Harvard but for the students. I mean, I went to University of Pittsburgh Law School. And like your school, it's a regional school. That's the nice term for saying that most of the people practice that come from the region, and they practice in the region. Harvard has never hired anybody from there before or since. And it was clear. And as I was saying down at the luncheon we had, I've been wanting to teach for 2 or 3 years. And Tony Amsterdam, who many of you know, was working in civil rights, and I told him about my interest. And he said, "Oh, don't go to that big conference at the AAO." I said, "Let me write letters for you." I'm Tony Amsterdam, it's a big name. And he wrote letters to 6, 8 of the major schools. Either got no response or a patronizing. We said, "Oh, Derrick Bell wants to." It's not interesting. But and at Harvard, I got that kind of response. And also, I'd gone up to teach a class there, invited by a young guy on the faculty who I had met because he was following me around as I was arguing cases in the Court of Appeals. And he was teaching a civil rights course, and I came up and lectured to his class, and I told him about my interest in teaching. He said, well, he'd look into it, and he came back or sent me a note saying that he had asked about, but there was no interest. They had no openings for someone with my expertise. Now here's this guy teaching the civil rights course with no experience, right? But what he had was a Harvard degree and a clerkship at the Supreme Court and a family background and what have you. So that was the background. So after Martin Luther King was killed, and after all the riots, suddenly all these institutions decided that, well, we better maybe do something. And the black students who were there then in some few numbers also exerted some little pressure. Later, a lot of the faculty used to deny, well, we never heard anything about black students. So I got in touch with some of the early graduates. They said, well, we didn't have any rallies and marches. We just met with some of the people we thought were the key persons and said, don't you think something should happen about this faculty, or don't you smell smoke? You know, that kind of thing. So I was hired, and it seemed to me my obligation was to help the successors of those who had helped me get into the into the job. So that the students we had 4 or 5 black men. But most of our minority students, both black, Asian, what have you, are women, you see. And I realized very tardily, I admit it, very tardily that I could not serve all the needs for the women who were likely going to have to play major roles as policymakers in the years to come. And I made this argument again and again, and the students made it. And I was mainly supporting their efforts because they were sitting in the dean's office and marching around and petitioning and what have you. And with no success. This would have been bad enough, but we had a woman who is a visitor, a black woman, who did everything that I was hoping that a woman of color would be able to do. And for whatever reasons, they decided that she wasn't good enough, and it was just a very upsetting thing. But the protest was really to support the students. It's so interesting. Let me make one other point. And it goes to really, it seems to me, and I should say this at the very end, but somebody might want leave and I won't hear it. It goes to really what I see is the key challenge for all of you in the social aspects of your careers, whatever your views on race and civil rights and what have you. And that it is this, that while there were no women of color, no black women on the faculty. There were 5 black men, you see. At the same time, there were no ethnic Americans, whose surnames were Italian, Polish, Greek. There was one Irish woman there, and she subsequently left. Although her class status was, I think her father was a federal judge or something like that. But no people who were white, coming up from the bottom, none on that faculty, you see. There are a lot of Jews on the faculty, but most of them came from very upper class backgrounds. In fact, the names had even changed in many instances. So that, and yet the idea of being able to reach out coalitions and get ethnic white Americans to join me, as opposed to taking a position with the faculty, would have been very, very difficult. And it seems to me that it's that inability to see that what blacks seek is what a hell of a lot of whites need, is the great challenge. Lonnie Guinier has a wonderful illustration in which he says black people are like the canaries in the coal mine. Everybody knows in the old days, it was so dangerous, and they would take a canary in a cage down into the mines, and somebody would watch the canary, and if the coal gases got bad, because of the canary's more sensitive lung system, if the canary stopped singing and kind of collapsed in the cage, they knew it was time to get out, you see. Well, black people serve that same function. What has happened in black communities in terms of crime and the devastation and the closing of the major business areas is the handwriting on the wall for much of this society. I think that those at the top are determined and are well on the way of turning this into a third world society with a very elite class at the top and most of the rest way much further down, pretty much beholden to them for, many of the jobs now, what is it? I can't remember. There's a huge placement operation that is really the largest employer. I think Walmart is number 2. How would you, that is not good, you see. And yet there's very little complaint about it, certainly very little action taken. The Republicans kind of say, well, things are not going so well, but they dare not be specific. Dole can't be specific about what everybody is concerned about because so many of his backers are the cause of the concern. You see, so that the great challenge for organizing and coalitions and what have you is to kind of reach across to recognize, and using Lonnie's thing, that when the blacks are falling over in the cages, as we are, that a heck of a lot of whites are falling over at the same time. Ending welfare as we know it. We know welfare as it exists is for the military-industrial corporate complex. Now that's welfare, building billion-dollar aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines that we don't need. Virtually no political opposition to that. You see, welfare is those agricultural giants, tobacco industry, McDonald's being subsidized. Now that's welfare as it exists. Welfare as we know it is black women getting welfare that they don't deserve, you see. So that there isn't immediately the kind of overwhelming opposition to what Clinton did that there really should be, since most women on AFDC are white. Most women, most people who are going to lose out on this thing are white. They're not black, and so that's the great challenge facing you. Okay,
Question.
Short question.
Would you please just come up to the mics and.
Good afternoon, Professor Bell. My name is Burvey Power. I'm the president of the BALSA at DePaul University. I'd just like to say I did read your book and I enjoyed it thoroughly. And one of my favorite chapters was entitled Nigger Free. And it was primarily so because you were able to successfully coalesce the history of race riots in America with the experiences of the main character in the book. I want to know, for the benefit of those who have not read your book yet, as well as to get your personal insights on what you actually intended to convey in this chapter, could you explain the evolution of the phrase nigger free from one of convenience on the part of the store owners and the management apartment managers to one of fulfillment on the part of the blacks in your book?
Yeah. I guess I had been reading in depth about the riots in the middle of the 19th century, late 19th century, and they are usually categorized as riots. But if you read any detailed studies, rather than a half page here, a half page there, you see that they, first of all, they were not instigated because whites thought some black had raped some white woman, which is, the birth of the nation syndrome. The fact is that most of them were sparked by envy and jealousy to put down blacks who seemed to be doing well on their farms or in a business or something like that, or because of white anxiety about economic conditions in their own situation. And while some of them, maybe they started off as riots, they usually ended as massacres. The blacks would fight off the whites the first time they attacked. The whites would retreat, come back as they did with, Rosewood in Florida, and come back in overwhelming force, just burn out, kill everybody, run them into the swamps and what have you. And what was so upsetting as I read it is the similarity between the conditions then and the conditions now. In so many of these instances, the police took this out and out, took the side of the whites. When they called in the National Guard, and they would take the side of the whites and just participate, boasting of how many blacks they had killed. And it just seemed to me that this could happen again. So the story is really based on my sitting in my office and hearing this a white rage riot, as it's come to be called, and trying to get from the village in New York, Greenwich Village, all the way up to way up Central Park West, where I live, in my various adventures as I try to make it away, and discovering that blacks had been ousted from stores and apartment buildings and all. And to preserve them from being burned down or attacked by the mobs, they would post signs that said "nigger free." And when I finally get to an area of some safety, a woman who has been a survivor, had gone through all of this, pulls out of the sign that when she was thrown out of her apartment building, she managed to rip it off the wall as she was being chased away, and she held it up and said that not only that it meant one thing to the white rioters, but it should mean another, our determination not to let this happen again, and to try to move forward. And I agree with her, although I said, gee, I bet the survivors of earlier riots probably had the same commitment, the same determination that it wouldn't happen again. I mean, I read that story now, I said, it scares me because it just seems that the potential for that is so real. I was suggesting that we now have, or soon will have, almost 1 million young black men in prison, often for nonviolent offenses. No rehabilitation happening there, no training happening there, hardening of hearts, if anything, to use a biblical analogy. And one wonders how long it will be before an Oklahoma City bombing tragedy is caused by disaffected blacks as opposed to disaffected whites. And what will be the I mean, the whole shift of tenor, maybe I'm just paranoid, when it was discovered that the bombers, or the alleged bombers, were not Palestinians or from the Near East, but rather a misguided white youth, you see. Now, I wonder how the tenor would shift. It turned out there were 2 former black convicts who had formed some radical revolutionary front and decided to do this. I just hate to think about the prospects.
Professor Bell, perhaps you could talk more about the connection between these historical events such as the riots that you were describing in the Nigger Free chapter, and events today. Because I think, one of the difficulties is that with the civil rights movement, the success of the civil rights movement has in many ways been part of the problem, and that is it's created this illusion that now we have civil rights, now we have an Equal Protection Amendment, now we have Brown versus Board of Education, now we have, for example, this discussion in which everyone is in here today. It's a group that is integrated that may not have been possible 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and so forth. And I'd like for you to talk, perhaps you could talk further about the anxieties that you're talking about and the fear that just sort of bubbling beneath the surface are the events in the Nigger Free chapter, for example, with this illusion that we kind of have that, everything is basically okay and, we've gone past that. It all happened before and we know how horrible it was, but it's all over now.
If I go back to what I was saying about the Harvard protests and the fact that whites had far more, ethnic whites, poor whites had far more reason to be protesting than I did, you could raise the question, why? Why wouldn't they? And it seems to me that history is a help, and you may have a different view on this. It seems to me that this is a country based on property. That's why they got together in 1787. All those were rich individuals who were understandably and appropriately concerned about their property. The Shays Rebellion had happened a year before. Farmers were not paying their taxes to help pay off the war debts and what have you. And things were in the Confederation just was not working for any number of reasons. And so they felt they needed a new government, one that would be stronger than the Confederacy, but one that wouldn't be like England and usurp their property. And so that's what they did. And they formed the government that was very good at protecting vested property. Most of the provisions focusing on property, both within the basic document and within the first 10 amendments, utilize brilliantly in some regards the emerging philosophies with regard to individual rights that governments should honor and respect. And they built those in a way so that people could use these individual rights that were going to be reflected in the document, so to protect their property rights. And that's how it came down. Now, there were many petitions to them about that time, since they were meeting a secret, that if there was going to be a new government, it should end this pernicious practice of slavery. And there was a lot of debate on it within that closed Philadelphia meeting room. But they finally could not get past the question of how does a government created to protect property, not protect property held by some enslaved. And they just could not get past that issue. And so the final Constitution has at least 3 provisions directly protecting the property in slaves, and about a half dozen others that indirectly protect it. Now, the fact is that most whites didn't own very much property. But what they had and what they'd been having since slavery started was what they had been promised as sort of what Cheryl Harris calls a property right in whiteness. That is, slavery could not have existed without the white yeomen, the workers, going along with it. But you'd say, well, why would they go along with it? Because they could never compete with the people who were able to afford slaves. And the reason they went along with it, as Edmund Morgan points out in his famous book, American Slavery, American Freedom, is because the slave owners promised the yeomen, the workers, greater freedom themselves. They were going to lower the poll taxes so that they could participate in the elections. They were going to lease small portions of land so that they would be able to begin on their own. They were going to facilitate those who wanted to move on west. And in return, they said, you have to stand with us in case these slaves who are now indentured for life, if they try to revolt or they try to escape. Well, you would think, hey, they would say, no, I'm not doing that, because most of the whites were closer to the slaves than they were to the people up on top of the hill. But it didn't work that way. They did identify, and they did when the slaves escaped. It wasn't the people up on the hill that went out into the swamps with the dogs. It was the workers that went out to bring them back, you see. And it's so interesting to use it because ever since, segregation was a later form of kind of recommitment by this society to working class whites who had very little and who were being exploited like mad during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, that, we still believe that you're better than blacks, and if what you want is segregation laws, that's what you can have. And that's why there was such opposition to Brown, because many whites, understandably and perhaps appropriately, saw it as a betrayal of what had been promised them as their portion, you see. So that today, not only does it at least indicate why they wouldn't, why Italians and Irish, who are much of Boston, wouldn't come immediately to my defense when I was protesting the lack of diversity at the Harvard Law School. Why there is so little opposition to the tremendous disparities in wealth and income and opportunity, and tremendous opposition among so many whites to affirmative action. It's precisely, it seems to me, the same thing. That there is a perception that, well, those guys up there, that's just the breaks, that they've gotten all of this up here. But this affirmative action, that's not right. Now, the fact that white women have been the major beneficiaries of affirmative action doesn't seem to mean anything. The fact that there are all kinds of other class-based situations that are do far greater harm to working class whites than affirmative action doesn't mean anything. It's because it's not nonsensical. It makes perfect sense if you see that what you really are entitled here is, as a white person, is that not that you're going to have equal share with these guys way up above, but that you are not going to have to take low and by your terms to somebody who is black. So if they have 2 points less than you on the LSAT, you're mad as hell, even though the alumni's kid may be on the other side of you, white, who had 20 points lower than you did, or the faculty's offspring, or God save us, the large contributors' kids, who are all there with these low LSATs, and nobody's concerned about it. But the poor little black person had 2 points less. They're raising Cain about that. That's it ruins meritocracy in our country. So I hope that kind of answered the question.
Professor Neal?
Professor Bell, I'm an Irish-American law professor in America, and I appreciate your comments about the Irish situation, a Polish situation, Italians, and making the argument that there may be some kind of natural alliance. I think you're right. I was a little troubled, though, by your comment where you seem to equate the Jewish members of the faculty at Harvard as somehow being part of upper classes or traditional ruling classes in America. And I don't know the biographies of all the Jewish professors at Harvard. I can think of one, Alan Dershowitz. I don't think Alan Dershowitz came from upper classes. And I'm just curious, I would have thought that you would find perhaps the Jewish exemplar with the kinds of discrimination the Jews have traditionally felt, not only in this country, but in the world as allies.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes you do. But not that much. I mean, some of the people, oh God, isn't it me? Frank Michelman represented me through all of this stuff, and would get more angry at some of the stuff that happened than I did, because they can't do this. I said, oh yes they can. But I think most of the Jews on faculty do come from upper class situations. The point, part of your point, at least that I hear, is that it wasn't too many decades ago that Jews were barred, not because they weren't smart, but because they didn't have the right cultural background. Then getting into Harvard, either as a student or certainly on the faculty, was very much a class-based thing. There's the old story about the Harvard old man who was a Harvard grad, hiring partner at a big firm, and he said, "Well, how do you choose your young associates?" So I only asked them 2 questions: "Young man, who is your father? And who is your grandfather?" And that's based on that is the determination of whether they get hired. Now we've come a long way from that, but I think most of the Jews really do come from upper class backgrounds. The disappointment is that they're not more like Frank, who recognize that this is another kind of exclusion that isn't any more fair or reasonable than the exclusion that their predecessors faced. You mentioned Alan. When I first came to Harvard, I tell on Alan, he can survive it. Alan was the darling of black students. Alan does come from a poor background. And I mean, the students would flock around him, and I remember we went on a retreat early on. He said, "Oh, these riots are happening. We have to get them off the streets, bring them and put them into the universities because they can." Oh, he would just preach like that man. But then as we went on into the 70s, and the interest kind of fell off, Alan, like many intellectuals, and particularly Jewish intellectuals, kind of switched. And now they were opposed to this affirmative action and these special preferences and things like that, because it sounds just like the quotas that we had to fight against. And Alan now is just absolutely opposed to all of the stuff. I mean, he doesn't want women there. But I never shall forget a faculty meeting with Al Sachs, who was a wonderful man. And they were just about ready to vote on a woman. And Alan said, I want you to be honest, Al, and tell me whether the fact that Diane so-and-so, or whatever her name was, whether the fact that she's a woman had anything to do with this appointment." Alan, and Al was generally such a calm guy, said, "It absolutely did have everything to do with it, a lot to do with this appointment, Alan. What are you going to do about it?" But he just would just go off to extremes like that. It was amazing. But it is a disappointment that that there isn't a greater sense of what is a person able to do as opposed to what is their pedigree. I would point out to folk as in my years of frustration. That hey, this minority candidate, you say that they don't have good credentials, but their credentials are a lot better than mine. I mean, they went to Harvard or Yale or what have you. They may not have been at the top of the class, but they did go to one of the major schools you respect, and they've done this. They worked at a large law firm. And they said, "No, they're still not good enough." I said, "Well, how can I be good enough and they can't be?" "Oh, yeah, well, Derrick, you're different." Which is sort of the ultimate kind of frustration. It's the kind of test that if you're nonviolent and still somehow have a weapon in front of you, would you use it? It's that kind of temptation. Go ahead.
My name is Eric Pohawa. I read an interesting article by one of your former colleagues at Harvard, Professor Kennedy. It was entitled Legal Education and the Reproduction of Hierarchy. I think it was in 1980 or 81. And in that article, he spoke about how the legal educational system in the U.S. Reinforces social class systems in the U.S. and establishes or preserves the elite's position in our society. And I wondered what your thoughts are on this topic, specifically as it relates to race relations in the legal community, in the larger society, and perhaps you might have some thoughts as to how you would like to see the legal educational system change to avoid this in the future.
Gee, if that's the same article that I'm thinking about, I don't remember that portion of it. But maybe.
Duncan.
Oh, it's Duncan Kennedy.
Duncan.
Oh. See, I have Randy Kennedy on the mind. Neither of whom is Irish.
I read it a long time ago.
No. Well, I think you accurately summarized that, and I think Duncan is right. I did a quick story. Actually, Pace Law School is in Westchester County. And it's made up mainly of first generation people going to college into law school. And I spoke there several years ago. And every time I mentioned affirmative action, the hostility was so bad, it was really something. And this one kid who, because I'd done a few classes and gave a lecture and whatever, and this kid was, so at the reception at the end of the day, he kind of backed me up and started going at it again about how bad this was and what have you. And he acknowledged that blacks had suffered discrimination, but he said, we got these laws now. That's a thing of the past. We have to go on merit. Merit is what made this country great. So I said, okay, listen. You believe in merit. Let me tell you something. Based on listening to you all day, I think you are as articulate and as able as students that I teach at Harvard or that I've lectured to at Yale, at Columbia. But when you finish from Pace and you go down to Wall Street and want a job, you're not going to get it. It's not going to be because some black person took it. It's because they would prefer to hire people whose parents were able to get them into Harvard and Yale and Columbia. No smarter than you, but they're going to take the jobs that you want to get ahead. What do you think about that? Well, his eyes glazed over. He hadn't thought about it at all, obviously. So I kind of pushed him and said, what do you think? Yeah, I mean, you're talking about merit and everything. And, here are these people. They're not better than you are. Well, he said, that's the breaks. I said, wow. I said, I know racism has messed up black folk. There's no sense in me trying to hide it. But it has done a real job. I said, that's the breaks. You're ready to kill somebody black if they get ahead of you with 2 points less than you do on the LSAT or 10 points or something like that. And that you're going to step back and let these white boys go get the jobs that you want to advance your career and take care of your family. Well, he said, drawing himself up, I hope one of these days I'm able to send my kids to Harvard or Yale. I said, "Oh, wow, it's really something," and that's the problem that we face. There's just a blind spot on the class situation, and again, partly because of this kind of property right in being white, and a willingness to kind of live the lives of the well-to-do through television and through the tabloids and things like that, and it's a challenge.
Good afternoon, Professor Bell. My name is Joseph McCoy, and I'm a second-year student at Northwestern, also president of the Black Law Student Association. And we are currently having many discussions with the powers that be with regard to their perceived lack of effort in terms of diversifying the faculty at Northwestern. And I'd just like you to comment as to whether there is a shrinking pool of qualified minority applicants that are necessary to create the type of diversity on the faculty that minority students and women students are looking for.
Well, you know what the answer is. The pool is elastic. When the need is there, they find folk. When the need is not there, they don't find people. If they find a few, the standard, the qualification go up. you see, so that after having 2 or 3 people on the faculty, particularly at a school like Northwestern, even worse at University of Chicago, the individual would not only have to graduate at the top of his class from an absolute major school, clerk for 2 justices, but also have to walk on water. You see. Even there, it might not be sufficient. You remember the famous story about Jesse Jackson riding in an open boat on a beautiful lake with the Pope, and suddenly a little gust of wind and the Pope's hat blew off. And everybody was trying to reach the Pope's hat. And finally, Jesse got up, stepped out of the boat, walked across the water, picked up the hat, and brought it back and put it back in the boat. The next day, the newspaper headlines blared, "Jesse can't swim." So that, to be more serious, the great challenge for those without, see, the First Amendment, the freedom of much of the First Amendment free speech rights were intended to help those with wealth, to protect the wealth. The great challenge is how those without wealth can advantage themselves, take advantage of those rights in ways that get attention but don't get you arrested. Now, that was the challenge in the 60s. It's the challenge in the 90s. And it has to be innovative. It has to be new. Taking over dean's offices is old. I mean, that creates no excitement. Either they throw you out or call the police or something like that, or more just move the dean's office to his auxiliary office right downstairs and keep on going. The great challenge is, what can students who really care about this do when the faculty is simply not going to do anything? You see, this is not when you've had 5 people, or when you have, John Marshall have 16 women? Wow, that's amazing. That's better than Harvard. I think it's better than NYU. But when you have 1 or 2 people, and there's no easy answer to that. See, I thought at Harvard that they had come up with a wonderful plan, and that is that, and they drafted the letter that was going to go to the dean that said, we are so upset about the lack of diversity with regard to women of color that we're going to take our exams, but we're going to put the answers in escrow until you all get serious about this thing. And they said, well, we're a little nervous, 3rd year and stuff like that. So they decided, well, we're not going to send a letter unless we get 100 signatures, right? Well, after people really thought about it, they only got 37 signatures. Now, I know that 37 signatures was more than enough, but they didn't know it, you see. And so there wasn't that willingness to do what almost certainly would have worked. They weren't going to deny graduation to 100 of these kids, because some of those kids' fathers or mothers were not going to stand for it, you see. But the kids didn't see it. So that in some part, the school is not going to do anything. And unless this perfect person comes along who can both swim and walk on water, and who's already gotten offers from Harvard and Yale, and somehow turned them down because they really want to go to Northwestern, right? Right. That's the person that they're looking for, and that person may not come about for a while. Particularly given Northwestern and University of Chicago's records. When you have a bad record for a long time, then the good people come and say, not me. I got to pioneer enough where there's a lot of folk. I don't want to go pioneer in 1998 where there's nobody and never been anybody. So that the great challenge is, how can students, within the scope of what you're willing to do. Now, if you're asking me, can you do it without risk? You can't. You can't do it without risk. The question is, what does it mean to you? Now, I guess that without fomenting revolution, I think that sometimes there is a blessing when schools take this elitist line like Northwestern. Now, if there are representatives here that I'm upsetting, we'll just use that as an example of many schools. That because that hard line does provide you with an opportunity, you see. I mean, schools are out there, you know, hiring whoever comes along and what have you. That's great. But there isn't the opportunity that provides. Rising to the opportunity doesn't require that you win. Rising to the opportunity simply requires that you rise. And in the rising, there is a kind of victory, a kind of triumph, so that in years to come, because, you know, as you look back and all the things that you hoped that happened didn't, you're really scrapping something. Now, what did I do that I'm proud of? And he said, well, I went to the dean when nobody else was going and said, Dean, I'm going to do X until we do such and such. You see. And if you wait for too much of a consensus, it's not going to happen. If I'd waited for the consensus of my 5 black colleagues, I'd still be sitting up there unhappy at Harvard about them not doing anything. Did they want to have other women? Yes. But we could have never agreed on what to do. They certainly were not going to take leaves without pay. That was just not their way. It wasn't that I was right and it was wrong. It wasn't their way. What you have to do is figure out what is your way. And what is it that you are willing to do? What do you feel comfortable with? Because it's not going to end with school. This is part of the unacknowledged curriculum. Because it's not simply on minority hiring by faculty. That's one way up there. You know, in any law school, legal education still has, notwithstanding that beautiful computer room upstairs, legal education still has a long way to go, so that our first year classes operate more like our clinical courses, you see, so that there's much more learning by doing and less learning by listening, learning by writing, learning by memorizing, so that there's more absolute learning by teaching. That's how you really learn. That's what our first year students should be doing, and our second year students. And it's not going to happen simply because there are some faculty who agree with me, because I know there are. It's only going to happen when students put down the idea of student and pick up the idea of customer, because that's what you are, and say, this is what we want. You say, well, but they got those grades, and they say it's anonymous, but I don't believe them. Believe them or not. If you want to do something, you're supposed to do it. Okay.
I'm more familiar with your work in critical race theory and your inclusion in those kind of symposiums and anthologies, and that speaks to the need for more narrative, and I think it goes to the argument of diversification. What I've seen at colleges and law schools is that the faculty gets diversified and the substantive classes don't change. The people who get into their either fear of power or pressure or just abrogation of responsibility really don't effectuate substantive change in legal education or how the school or the program or the curriculum operates. So what I was hoping that you'd speak to is how to get this need and this criticism and this recognition that you see in critical race theory into substantively changing the law field, because you see it with judges not changing their decisions once they get appointed as well. So how, once you get this diversification, it actually effectuate change in the real world?
Not easy. First of all, it's very much easier to criticize what's going on than it is to come up with something better. And my experience is that everything that I think is better is a hell of a lot more work. You know, I mean, even in my seminars, I started having people turn in papers every week that I wrote responses and gave them back, because people get so little feedback. And I remember on a plane coming back from someplace, and I had all these papers spread out. And one of my faculty colleagues came back and said, "What are you doing?" And I explained it to him. He said, "Gee, you're trying out for early sainthood?" You know, he wasn't about to do anything like that. And I was spending 20 hours a week. But it just seemed, it was such a glorious thing to get something from people in writing and give something in writing back, because you get so little experience in that. But it's all you can do is set your own example and hope that maybe somebody else is going to follow. I said earlier that I have a new constitutional law book that should be out by the end of the year. And did I say it here or did I say it? That was at lunch. Yes. Anderson Publishing is putting out a new constitutional law text that reflects how I've been teaching the course for a number of years. And there are 2 volumes. The first volume is about 35 hypothetical questions that raise most of the substantive issues in the course. And after each of the questions, there is about a 10-page summary of the applicable law. And part 2 is the edited cases, which I still can't get away from, although I surely would like to. And so what I do with the classes is people choose which case they want to brief and argue. And every day my classes are 3 hours long. And then it's still not quite long enough. But we argue one of those cases, and then we have a class conference about it, which is a little hard with 80 people, but we can do it. And then the students who have argued the case, who now really know the case, they write a final exam question based on that subject material, using some new facts or maybe changing the facts they had from the case. So by the end of the term, everyone has had to argue a case, everyone has had to brief a case, and everyone has a stack of these final exam questions. So on final exam day, everybody gets one question. They don't know which one, but they get one. But that's a good way of getting to read all of them, which is the idea. And then after they write for an hour, I collect the answers. Do I immediately grade them? No. I give them back to the students who wrote the question in the first place. They know probably as much about it as I do. You see, then I go over and give it legitimation, but students then get feedback even on a final exam, which would be almost impossible for even the most well-meaning teacher to provide, because there's just too many papers. So the students have a grade based on about 4 or 5 activities. My attendance is always very good. The participation is always very good. The problem is the grading, because everyone has worked up to their potential. And the school still wants you to give grades based on a curve. So that it just creates a lot of frustration for me. But at least it's a move in a different direction. But do you think Little Brown published my text, Race, Racism, and American Law. I went to Little Brown with my constitutional law book. Oh, they loved it. The editor came down and sat through one of the classes. Oh, wonderful, she said. But they kept dragging their feet on sending me a contract. And they finally decided they didn't think enough con law teachers would adopt it to make it worthwhile. So I got Anderson Publishing to do it. But all of this is tough. But if you do it in the hope of general acceptance, you're just fooling yourself. You have to do it because you want to do it. And then maybe way down the line, somebody will pick up a piece and somebody else will pick up another piece. And the same thing from the student side. You gotta, whether it's a teacher who unwittingly says something that is rather insensitive, particularly to women or minorities or gays and lesbians or what have you. If you sit there and stew about it, boy, you're going to be stewing a long time. The teacher may not even recognize what he or she said. But once you go into the office and say, gee, that really upset me, the teacher may say, I don't care. Probably won't. But once you have gotten it off your chest, that burden is off you. It's on the other person. It's highly recommended. I get it all the time.
Mr. Bell, hi. My name is Adam Stern. I'm a graduate of Valparaiso University, and I met you 2 years ago when you spoke there. But now I'm an attorney that works with abused and neglected children here in juvenile court in Cook County. And I haven't read your book yet. I'm going to buy it. But speaking of gospel choirs, how can I turn that and relate that to the children, the population that I work with, where I'm seeing so many black females who are becoming pregnant and black males who are getting involved in criminal activity and gangs, and I want to cross the bridge from your book to working with that population. If you can say something on that.
I mean, you really are dealing with the results of what William Julius Wilson and any number of others. His book is titled "When Work Disappears." We had segregation when I was growing up in the 1930s. There was certainly crime in the black community. There was certainly family disorganization, spousal abuse, but it was nothing on the line that it is now. And I think that there may be multiple causes, but the basic thing is when people don't work, the whole thing falls apart. Work in this country is essential to having money to pay bills. It's essential for your class status. It's essential for your self-esteem. When you take that away, I've lived in communities out in Seattle for a while where most of the people worked at Boeing aircraft, and when Boeing had a letdown for half a year, this very upper middle class, very white community started a slow process that started looking like it eventually would get into the ghetto. Family breakup, spousal abuse, alcoholism, suicide, kids running away. You see, I mean, it's no respecter persons when I mean, we think about ourselves. If we suddenly our income source stops, maybe we're strong and ethical people and moral, and we kind of face it and deal with it. But it's tough. It's very tough, and if you don't have very much at the beginning, then you know it. And when you go a whole generation, it doesn't get better. It gets worse, and you're dealing with some of the fallout of a couple of decades of no employment, no work history, no training, and what have you. The amazing thing is that there are any of those families living in those situations that still are struggling to live decently. Cite Bess from Porgy and Bess. You see. So that the answer is you do what you can. You know, but you recognize, and the hard thing is that I used to tell the legal aid workers that working with, the hard thing is not to identify with the system and to put all the blame on the victims, because it's so tempting to just kind of shift. Oh, these folks are no good. Well, they certainly have a lot of no good manifestations, but you got to look at the society. I mean, you know, that's the whole story of Jean Valjean. That's the whole story of Oliver Twist. That beyond what you see there, there's a society and policymakers making decisions that ruin lives.
Give me a second. Professor Bell, first off, I'd like to say that I'm an attorney, and I've admired your writings and your stand for many years. Two questions I had for you. One, what is your wish or your goal in teaching? What do you wish to elicit from your students? What do you wish them to get, both in their personal lives and their professional lives as a professor? Second question is, any comment you want to make. I know people are tired of hearing this, but I didn't hear your comments during the trial and during the second trial, O.J. Simpson, and putting that in the context of what you've spoken about today. That can be with the media, that can be in the legal aspect, whatever you wish to comment on, the context of your talk today, but also what you wish to elicit from your students as a professor.
Well, very quickly, on the second one, I really have made very little comment on the O.J. Simpson trial. It's simply too painful for me to see the kind of attention and resources that have gone into that case, the kind of exceptional representation Simpson has had, at the same time that every day hundreds of young black, Hispanic, and white have gotten sentenced to far more than whatever they did or were supposed to have done, with virtually no representation, with no investigators to go out, with no people coming in before the sentencing and stuff like that. So it's just it's a sham and a charade that simply distracts us from the serious injustices that our criminal justice system does in this country. And it's just, so I really did not follow the trial much at all. I give the commentator feel over to Alan Dershowitz and what's the talk show guy who made a fortune, Geraldo and stuff like that. As to the students, it seems to me that the teacher really, whatever his course or her course, is really teaching himself or herself. And that that you therefore try to pass on what you have learned. For me, one of the things is that lawyers are, whether the job market is good or bad, are really privileged, that they can always scrape together through their own practice enough to keep food on the table and, kind of keep going. May not be rich, but they can kind of keep going. And knowing that, there's this wonderful opportunity that beyond a reasonable tolerance, they should take shit from nobody. And that just kind of moves you to a whole different. Now, my late wife Jewel used to say, yeah, Eleanor Holmes Norton is on 12 corporate boards, and Vernon Jordan is on 15 corporate boards, and how many are you on? Well, the answer is none. However, there's a great feeling that I think one of the things that there's all kinds of ways of spelling freedom, and one is feeling that you don't have to bow down and take a whole lot of stuff messing up your insides beyond a reasonable tolerance. So that's one of the things. Actually, one of the worthwhile things about the Harvard thing is it gave me a chance, again, to practice what I preach all the time. I've never regretted it, and I think others who have followed that route have not forgotten it. One of my models was Judge Hasty, William Hasty, who early on was appointed to the War Department in World War II. Frankfurter told him he should take the job because he would be able to help desegregate the military. Well, Hasty got undermined every little thing he tried to do. And finally he quit, not quietly, but very publicly, you see. And he was really hailed across the black community for leaving this prestigious job. Now, of course, he went on to become the governor of the Virgin Islands and first black federal judge and then Court of Appeals, very respected man and what have you. So you don't sacrifice your career. You don't necessarily. It's a risk. And to get that across in whatever you're teaching and all, it seems to me it's worthwhile. The other thing I think I really have touched on, I've got to kind of close with that, is that the problems that I've been talking about and that many of you are concerned about are overpowering. It may not be possible to save this society, you see, because there's so many factors that look like it's pointing us down, with blacks on the bottom, but with the rest of the society coming down on top. No way we can know that there's an easy formula or what have you. Probably isn't an easy formula. But it, again, as with the situation in law school, it's also a challenge. It's also an opportunity to do something with your life that you can be proud of. Risky, yes. You know, my Alice Walker story again, and I tell all the time that before Alice Walker became Alice Walker, she had gotten an offer to do it was kind of a biographical piece for a major magazine. About her life growing up in Georgia and what have you. And she prepared a manuscript and they went off to a fancy restaurant, the editors and they started telling her all the changes they wanted her to make. And it did not really go with her life, you see. And she argued with them, and finally one of the editors got really very annoyed and said, Alice, you don't understand. If you want us to publish this piece, you have to make these changes. Alice stood up, gathered up all her manuscripts and said, you don't understand. All I have to do in life is save my soul. And she didn't mean necessarily a religious kind of thing. It was saving her inside, saving her integrity, saving who she saw herself as, you see. And that, it seems to be, is the great challenge. There's so many temptations to go, well, I'll give off a little bit of my integrity here because I could get this job and then I'll be able to do such and such and such. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. But sometimes we're doing it without even knowing it. But they kind of have a sense that this is something I have to protect at all costs, kind of get you on the right direction. Lawyers have a better chance of fulfilling that, but also more temptations to lay it aside. So that's my word after 40 years. If I can survive another 5 years, I may come back with something more new, different, changed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Again, I would like to thank all of you for coming here today. The next event is the reception and book signing, which is down on 3 East. If you take these elevators down to the 3rd floor and go out